Hello and welcome to the 4th New South Wales Family Daycare Association webinar in the PD in Your Pocket series. My name is Elizabeth and I'm your facilitator for this evening. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the country we meet on today. I know that we're on many different lands with many different traditional owners, but I'm currently presenting from the land of the Gadigal and the Wongal people, and I would like to acknowledge them and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. I'd like to pay respects to the elders past, present and emerging. I acknowledge that Aboriginal families have cared and educated for children on this land for tens of thousands of years. I have you all muted this evening just so it doesn't get too busy with background noise. However, it is a Zoom webinar, so you can see me. And in a moment, I'm going to share the PowerPoint slide with you. So everyone should now be able to see the presentation. Now, before we begin tonight's session, I just want to go through some steps to familiarise you on how PD in Your Pocket works in case you've forgotten. So the first thing you do is you receive your resource booklet. We sent you a link to a specially prepared booklet at the beginning of the month, and you've had a couple of weeks to read through this. If you didn't receive it, you can find the link on the screen if you're watching this presentation. If you're listening as a podcast, the link is available on our website. You then receive great content through this webinar. You will either be participating in this webinar live, watching it as a video, or listening to it as a podcast. If you are participating in it live, remember that you can always go to PD in Your Pocket page on the website and watch or listen to it later if there's anything that you'd like to hear again. This session is short and should go for about 45 minutes. For those who are participating in it live, we will then follow this session with an interview with an expert on practices. Then, just for those who are participating in it live, we'll then have a 20-minute session for questions, and you can ask any questions that you have on the session. After the session, you'll then receive follow-up reading, and these have been specifically chosen for this topic. You can discuss all of the things that you see tonight on Facebook. When you're enrolled, we invited you to join a closed Facebook group with other educators and family daycare people. You can discuss the topic with them all, and you can tell them what you do at your service and find out what they're doing at theirs. If you have any questions about PD in Your Pocket, you can email info@nswfdca.org.au. So this session has been funded through the New South Wales Department of Education Sector Development Program. I'd like to start by asking everyone who has read the information booklet that we sent. If you'd like to use the hands up function and show me, that would be fantastic. Great, we've got lots of hands up coming through. So it looks like lots of people have seen that booklet, which will give you a really good background information before you listen to this session. So tonight we're going to be concentrating on two main areas. The first one being what the practices are, and then identifying the practices in action. We will be viewing a number of short videos during this session. So if you're listening to this session on a podcast, you may also want to view the video of the session at some stage. And as I mentioned, these are all available on the website. Great, so let's first have a look at what are the practices. When you think about being, belonging and coming in the early years framework for Australia, or you may be using My Time, Our Place, which is the framework for school age care in Australia, you may be familiar with the learning outcomes, as we use these a lot in our documentation, and you may even be familiar with the principles. But the question tonight is, are we really familiar with the practices? So the principles underpin practice that is focused on assisting all children in making progress in relation to the early years outcomes. If all educators pay attention to these 8 practices, and you will end up providing good quality education and care. So the practices provide a really important role. And that's what tonight's all about, is getting familiar with them and comfortable with them so we can apply them to our own educational practice. Both the EYLF and My Time, Our Place have very similar practices. You can see them on the screen here in this table. If you can see that the text runs across a column that incorporates both the EYLF and the My Time, Our Place, it means that that same practice is identical in both the EYLF and My Time, Our Place. So these are the practices of the learning frameworks, and we're going to learn a little bit about each of them tonight. I really encourage you to read and reread the booklet that goes with this session as it goes through each practice clearly. So the first practice we're going to look at this evening is being responsive to children. This practice probably comes really naturally to most family daycare educators. It's about having a deep knowledge about each child in your care, for using that knowledge to respond to each child as they are unique individuals. The difference between using this practice really well and just using it lies in your knowledge of each child. Knowledge of their differences, including the different ways they learn, and how you use this knowledge to help each child continue to learn while in your care. It's also about using children's interests as the basis of what learning activities you organise for them. So we should all be quite comfortable in programming for children based on what we've observed about them. Educators use a variety of approaches to deepen their understanding of what works best for individual children. Professional learning, discussions with other educators, and reflection can all assist them understand in the approaches to learning. When developing a responsive learning program, educators may gather and analyse information about each child's progress from a wide range of sources. Reflect and respond to children's similarities and differences, and build on capabilities, strengths, interests, and knowledge. Provide activities for children to explore, solve problems, communicate, think, create, and construct. Support children-directed, adult-led, and guided play and learning, teaching and learning approaches. And we'll talk later about how the practices have a really nice balance of both of these. We'll promote and use practices that have been shown to be successful in supporting children's learning and development, and challenge and change those practices that have not achieved success. We're going to look at gathering information that supports, informs, assess, and enriches decision-making about appropriate professional practices. So these strategies should all be supported and sustained and share interactions with the children. The next practice that we look at is adopting holistic approaches. So this practice encourages educators to take a holistic approach to teaching children. Holistic is not a word that's commonly used. It means involving the whole of something and not just a part of it. So holistic, when used to describe for educators, we mean that you pay attention to all parts of the child and everything going on in their world. It gives us a really inclusive look of that child. This practice is asking you to pay attention to children's physical, personal, social, emotional, and spiritual well-being, as well as cognitive aspects of learning. Again, this is something that most family daycare educators do without thinking too much. It should come quite naturally. Holistic teaching is also remembering that a child belongs to a family and a community, and that they're learning from these as much as they're learning from family daycare. So try and remember that you're just one piece of the puzzle for this child's learning journey. They're also getting learning from all different environments that they engage with. Holistic learning is about teaching children about their connections to the natural world. Educators who teach holistically in this sense fosters children's capacity to understand and respect the natural environment and learn about the interdependence between people, plants, animals, and land. The next practice that we're going to have a look at is intentional teaching. So this is one of the practices of the EYLF that educators often misunderstand. It's not just about the times that you have had children in a circle around you, and as you read them a book or teach them about fairness or counting or a really specific topic, although this could be an example of intentional teaching. But it's really about so much more than that. It's about an educator being deliberate, purposeful, and thoughtful in their decisions and actions. It's not just about putting out the same resources daily, but being mindful of what you're putting out, thinking about what each child is interested in and what skills and knowledge do they need to develop. Say with a baby who's on the verge of crawling, an intentional teaching moment could be putting down on the ground a really popular toy that they enjoy, just out of reach to try and encourage that final step towards crawling. An educator acting intentionally would be doing these things to encourage that child in development. It's also about your thinking. So saying you're buying new toys for the sandpit, do you buy 4 of the super new shovels to minimize fights, or do you only buy 1 of them to encourage it as an opportunity to teach about sharing? So depending on your thought processes and your intentions, that's how intentional teaching comes about. So it has intention. The other thing is you can think about all kinds of aspects of resources. So do you buy the blue shovel and the pink shovel and think about resources being gendered? Do you buy lots of the same shovels so that children can work in cooperation to dig a big hole? Do you buy a shovel but use takeaway containers from the kitchen so that you're using recycled materials instead of purchasing new things? So there's so much to think about when we get into intentional teaching. I'm going to play a video now, and I want you to think about how the educator is using intentional teaching as a practice. So I'll pause my video for a moment and we'll watch this video.
There's a big one up here, is there? Oh, look at this one, Christelle. Look at that. Okay, just move back so we can see how big it is. Do you think that one would be a big carrot yet?
Yeah.
All right, well, can you hold it together? Christelle, do you want to... All right, well, you pull that one out and Mike can pull this one.
That one's not big enough.
It's not big enough. What about this one Christelle's got?
Let's see. Let's see.
Ah. Can you do it? Oh. Here you go. You just pull hard. Is it going to come out? I'll give it a bit of a move. You go. Pull. What's that?
That's tiny.
That's a tiny one, isn't it? Look, that's a round one. Look at that one. That almost... Look at that.
That is the big carrot.
Oh, it's a big carrot. Do you want to take that home tonight?
Yeah.
Look at that. Do you think you can cook it for dinner? Want to take it home for Mum?
First, you need to wash it.
Well, we do need to wash it, yes, first. Of course we do. Are there any snow peas? No snow peas.
That's no pea.
All right. Now, could you girls water the garden for me?
Yes. That's not fun.
I know, it keeps blowing off in the wind, darling. Christelle, do you want to, can you water some of the,
Can
yep,
I?
can you water some of the carrots, please? Because they need a lot of water because it's very hot yesterday. Okay, I'll hold your carrots. We'll put those over here. Very. Woo. Hey, darling, you can play with the balls. Do you want to do this? All right. Can you play with that one?
Yeah.
Yeah. We're going to throw the ball. Here you go, look. Pew. You do that? Oh, look. The flowers look beautiful. They're growing.
Look,
Abby, it's gone white. What's that?
It's white.
What is it, darling Abby?
It's white.
Okay. Is it? Okay, let's have a look. Look how big, that's bigger. And look at this one. I think we could probably cut that one today.
And that,
How many can we see? How many broccoli are there?
1, 2, 3.
3 broccoli. That's fantastic.
Look, that's right.
That's the marigold. Do you remember what the marigold does?
It keeps all the bugs away from the garden.
That's right. Now we've got some eggshells for our garden too. What does the eggshell do? Look at this. Maya, Abby, look what I found on our garden. Got to be very quiet. Abigail, come here. Look. Look what this is. Can you see that?
What is it?
It's a cricket. It's a cricket on our spinach. Can you see this, Abby?
A cricket?
There's a cricket on our spinach. You must like spinach, do you think? You could be like Popeye. Yeah, I know. Do you think he's going to eat it?
Yeah.
Look.
Oh,
Look at him. He doesn't want to get off. What's that? Oh, he's beautiful. Look at his long legs. Can you see his eyes? He is cute, isn't he? But you know what we might do? We might put him somewhere else so he doesn't eat our vegetables. Would that be okay? All right, let's go find another spot of the garden for him.
So wasn't that a great experience to watch? And did you notice how the educator was teaching children about how to judge whether the vegetables were ready for picking, and how the garden needed watering because it was very hot yesterday? You could also teach her, you could also hear her teaching counting with the broccoli and pointing out the cricket as well, which looked like it was a new experience for the children. And teaching that the cricket was cute, not yucky, but that it did need to be relocated for the benefit of the vegetables. So there was so much teaching going on, lots of learning happening in those few minutes. But it only happened because the educator had planted the vegetables with the children and involved them in the growing and caring, and because she thought to bring in each element like the counting and the discussion of the cricket. So that was a very teacher-led experience, and the children gained so much from that. Okay, so the next practice that we're going to discuss is planning and implementing learning through play. So we won't spend a great deal on this topic. If you didn't participate in the first PD in your pocket topic about play, you can definitely go back and listen and watch that. I do recommend that you do that, and also reading the booklet and the further readings, because there's so much information in that package about learning through play. This practice is about how you as an educator plan for children's learning through setting up opportunities for children to play and how to work to ensure that children and learning are through their play. I'm going to show a small video now about how planning for play doesn't need to be extensive or expensive in terms of obtaining resources.
Whoa.
Play absolutely does not have to cost a lot. Kids really need materials to play. They need something to manipulate, which doesn't necessarily mean they need toys. The best materials are open-ended materials, which means that the same object can be used in lots of different ways and by lots of different age groups. The best example of open-ended materials that are fantastic for play are natural materials. Petals and leaves and sticks and the dirt and sand and water. They're everywhere, they're free, and they provide your children with a huge variety of opportunities for play. So a stick, it can be a sword, it can be a digging implement, it can be my microphone, it can be the structure that I build something with, it could be something that I jump over, it could be something that I use to measure something. It is an open-ended material, can be used in lots of different ways. And if we're thinking about man-made objects, some of the best things in my experience are balls. From babies all the way through to 10 and 12-year-olds can be playing amazing games with balls. Cardboard, recycled containers and boxes and tubes can be used for all sorts of things. And even something like strips of fabric or scarves. You know, they can be dress-ups. You can make cubbies out of them. You can go and have a picnic with it. You can dance with them. They can be all sorts of things for all sorts of people and all sorts of types of play. The more they need to use their imagination, to think about how they're playing, to problem solve, try a new way, to use their bodies, use their minds, or connect with somebody else, the more that they're able to do that, the more development is happening in their brains and across their whole body.
So great ideas there about some inexpensive play resources. So the next practice we're going to look at is creating physical and social learning environments. Now this is all about deliberately creating spaces that children can learn from and in. The EYLF tells us that indoor and outdoor environments support all aspects of children's learning and invite conversations between children, early childhood educators, families, as well as the broader community. The important thing to remember with this one is that learning frameworks are not just talking about physical spaces in our homes and gardens. It's also talking about creating spaces where it is safe to learn, safe to make mistakes, safe to practice something again and again until a child has mastered it. It's about creating relationships with children so that they know you will rejoice in their learning. It's about making sure that all children learn simultaneously. The video you're about to see, you may have seen before if you participated in the New South Wales Family Daycare Safe Spaces professional development a few years ago. And I should point out that this video is designed for newer educators. So let's take a look.
In family daycare, while you are caring for children, you are also educating them. Some learning just happens, other learning comes by careful planning by the educator. That's why it's important for educators to create great learning spaces. To create great learning spaces, you need to think about both your indoor spaces and your outdoor spaces. Set up your indoor spaces so children have access to resources to help them meet the learning outcomes of the Early Years Learning Framework or the Framework for School Aged Care. You need to have spaces with tables and chairs to work at, for children to relax in, for art and music, for exploration, to display work, for pretend play, to store toys and equipment. Outdoors isn't just a space for play. Children learn a lot from outdoor play. You need spaces for music, for digging, to read, art areas, cubby houses, tables and chairs, spaces to use balls, spaces to grow things in. Children need spaces to read and to hold books in. You need spaces where you can read books to children. Think about making reading spaces cosy with cushions and blankets and low shelves to display books. You could have fairy lights or indoor tents or small chairs. Think about the sort of space you would like to relax and read in. Spaces where children can build things are very important in family daycare. Can children have a place in your home where they can make things from blocks or other construction materials? Children in family daycare need places for imaginative play. It could be a home corner or play kitchen area. It can be a dress-up area where children can use clothes to imagine they are someone else. When children are young, they need spaces to develop what is known as gross motor skills. These are the physical skills which require whole body movement and which involve the large muscles of the body. Have you got places where children can run, jump, hop, throw and catch, climb up, down, over, under and through things, pedal on ride-on toys or scooters or push toys, push and pull, practice crawling and walking? Under the education and care laws, your family daycare provider has to make sure that you have taken every possible precaution to protect children from injury at your home. They also have to make sure you have enough furniture, materials, and toys and equipment, and that everything in your home, including the toys and equipment, are in good repair. Creating great learning spaces for family daycare can be fun, much like being a family daycare educator. In family daycare,
Great, so some really useful information there. So we have to deliberately set up spaces for children to learn in. They're best as open-ended, non-complicated, structured learning experiences. The EYLF talks about vibrant and flexible learning spaces. Examples of what this means includes just leaving some PVC pipes in the sandpit, which invites children to bring their own open-ended creativity to their play. In a home-based setting, pets are a great option, such as hens, rabbits, mice, fish. They create natural interactions that are great invitations for intentional learning about animals and their care. Less structured approaches will help to enable the learning to be responsive to children's interests and abilities, so being really flexible there. Open-ended activities don't just have one way of a response from the children. They are a great way to cater for different capacities and learning styles. Remember that learning environments are social as well as physical. Do children at your family daycare feel comfortable to take risk, to try and fail and then try again? Do you create an environment where children feel okay to learn in? So the next one that we're going to look at is valuing the cultural and social context of children and their families. Now, this practice is about how culturally competent we are, about how we as educators and our service have both the desire and the practices to ensure we work towards understanding and acceptance of all cultures in Australia and work towards dismantling injustice and racism. The major issue with this one is that we often believe that other people have cultures and don't take into account that we actually have a culture as well. So there is a dominant culture in Australia, that being the Anglo-Saxon culture, but because it's dominant, it doesn't make it better. We need to ensure that we're aware of the cultural and social context of the families in our service and value the knowledge of their culture and what their children can bring to our family daycare. It is also especially important to help children learn about Indigenous culture and about the culture of Australia's first people. So cultural competency can be really challenging for all educators. It's great to observe events throughout the year, such as NAIDOC or National Islander or Aboriginal Children's Day. But true cultural competence will involve understanding and connecting with the culture at a greater level. For example, we want to explore the history, the policies that impact and the impacts of colonisation, understanding the resulting complexities of health and education issues, acknowledging the ongoing impact of post-colonial history of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. The practice of cultural competency, particularly in relation to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander families and communities, can start with learning about their traditions, customs and history of the land that you're on, getting to know your local families, being open to establishing relationships, signaling this in the setup of your family daycare. So from the very beginning, when you're first setting up, it's an important thing to incorporate. For example, having acknowledgement of country at the entrance that identifies the country and the people of the area you're in. You could also display Indigenous flags or artwork. Make sure it's done in a meaningful way and not just a tokenistic way. Being aware of these issues on this level is part of a holistic understanding of children in our care. It can also help the next generation of non-Indigenous Australians to have more sensitivity and understanding of their past. It is possible that one of the upcoming PD in Your Pocket sessions will be all about cultural competency, so we won't spend too much longer on this topic now. The next practice we'll discuss is providing for continuity in experiences and enabling children to have successful transitions. Now, this refers to the big transitions in young children's life, like transitions to big school and the transitions that occur when, for example, a new baby is born in the family. But it's also about the transitions that occur during the day. When a child is dropped at your place, the transitions during the day when they're picked up by the parents to go home. So there's lots of different transitions that children experience, some big, some small. Moving into a new situation is a time of change for children that involves forming new relationships, leaving older relationships behind, taking on new roles and responsibilities. Some children and their families enjoy transitions while others may become quite anxious. So you need to get to know how the family and the child is feeling so you can cater for their individual needs. Children often don't cope with change easily. Educators really need to support children at transition times by providing structures to support children to understand the change and make the change easier for them. To think about the transition strategies, let's talk through a typical day. So you're probably already instinctively aware of many things that are going on and that I'm about to mention. But even so, it can sometimes be a great step to go through them again and think about where we might need to review or adjust our practices to make it work better. So first, let's look at the welcome. So when we welcome children into our family daycare, you might think about crouching down to the child's level and talking with genuine interest when you're greeting them, giving them eye contact, connecting with anything brought in from home to share. They might have brought some show and tell or a comforter or something to help that transition from the home environment to the care environment. You can address that and have a conversation. Encourage the parents to take time to settle the child and calmness and structure to any directions given. So that's really reassuring for young children. Then we get through the day. So throughout the day, as we continue on after we've greeted and welcomed the child, We need to think about linking transitions. So for example, improve the flow from individual playtime to group time by having some of the children recount what happened in the previous transition. You could also think about the number of transitions you're having in one day. Are you giving the children enough time to become involved and finish activities? Or are there too many transitions so that they're changing activity, or they're changing the area of the room maybe too frequently? It's a really good thing to consider within your daily routine. Structure is important, but if it leads to the same issues day after day, it's also great to review and identify those traps and adapt the structure using the learning experiences that we were given. And then it's time to go home, which in itself is another transition, transitioning from the care environment back into their home environment. Encourage physical greetings from parents and sharing the child's experiences with interest and open-ended questions. I know it can be a hard time of the day for educators. We might be at the end of our energy levels, but it's really important to make sure that that family goes home with information and that they're securely handed over and they have that positive transition time. Encourage parents to give time and not to rush off to the next thing. So have a little bit of time in between jumping in the car and rushing off home or rushing to the next event. And let them share their achievements from the day. Note that some children find the end of the day really difficult. Some things to remember if this occurs, it may sometimes involve the children acting out with their behaviour. So they may sometimes lash out at their parents, or they may run off and hide. And that's perfectly normal. Their energy levels are quite low too. They may have had a big day. They may have been very active or emotional. So make sure you can adjust. If this happens, provide them with the opportunity to provide the family and yourself the opportunity to put yourself in the child's shoes and understand what they might be thinking and feeling. Maybe they're simply just really tired. It can be helpful to proactively plan the process of going home to help it be predictable and an opportunity for a child to share a bit of their day with their parent. So maybe you could have a bit of a process of when you know if particular parents are coming at a regular time every day and you know that that time's coming up, you might want to start mentally preparing the child. So putting the shoes on, packing their bag and letting them know that soon it will be time to go home. These little transitions during a child's day may seem insignificant to us as adults, but to the child, they can make a huge difference in their experience with family daycare. Okay, so the next practice that we're going to look at is assessing and monitoring children's learning. This practice is about how you gather information about what children know and can do. It is about your planning, documentation, and evaluation of children's learning. Think of assessment primarily as a way of summing up what the child has learned. You assess children's learning by using the planning cycle of observing, analysis, planning, implementing, and reflecting. So assessment is a key practice. Assessment is essential to planning new learning and development. What children make or write or draw or say or do is the basis for discovering what a child knows and understands. It's important to focus on each child's own progress, not where the child is up to in relation to other children. Emphasising their personal progress is the key to communicating back to the parents. It's also the way of identifying where the child needs support, so you can clearly see their strengths and where they need to continue developing. So some tools and strategies for assessment include scrapbooks. They help direct the conversation with parents to the progress that the individual child is making over time. This keeps the key focus on planning next step in learning and then reflects on the child's learning styles, strengths, and the areas that need support. You could also look at doing some self-assessment as another strategy. showing children the evidence of their own progress. Something that some services do that I find fantastic is they show drawing or writing samples throughout the year, and you can clearly see how they've developed. So you might take a drawing or writing sample in January, and then again in July, and then in December. And if you put them next to each other, you can clearly see how that child is developing. And that's a fantastic way of self-assessment. It's great because the children can see visually how they're developing, and it's a great thing for parents to record and document. The children can be part of the conversation around self-assessment as well as their parents. Another strategy you can do is obviously your observations by the educators, and these are based on your experience and your expectation of where the child would typically lie. This is particularly valuable for identifying the need of psychological or other assistance for children who require it, being alert to what activities are not working, either for your group or children or individuals, and guiding the planning for next steps in learning. And lastly, we could think about holistic sources. So assessment should take into account cultural factors, home learning environment, and the opinions of the families or other people who know the child. So make sure you're taking that into consideration as well. So that a full and accurate picture starts to emerge of the needs and styles of each child, we need to look at each of these strategies. Each child is unique and also a product of their environment around them. Assessment needs to be addressed both dimensions to be authentic and holistic and enable them to achieve effective learning. Great, so that's the end of our presentation side of this evening. We're now going to move on to a video with an expert. The video I'm about to show you goes for about 30 minutes, and it's an interview with Dr. Anne Kennedy. Dr. Kennedy works as a consultant, researcher, trainer and writer in the education and care sector. She was a member of the Charles Sturt University Consortium, which developed the Early Years Learning Framework, the EYLF, and she's being interviewed by education and care sector journalist Lisa Bryant. This video is on PD in Your Pocket webpage if you want to view it later. We will then, after the video, have time for our questions.
So thank you everyone to this interview about using the practices of the Early Years Learning Framework in family daycare. I'm really pleased to be joined today by Anne Kennedy, who's a bit of a legend in this sector, but I'll let Anne give an introduction to herself. Anne, tell us who you are.
Hello everyone, and thanks for having me, Lisa. It's great to be with you, even if it is by Zoom. Well, I've worked in the sector a long time, and I've been very involved with the sector since the EYLF was developed. I was one of the writing team, and much of my work has been on kind of translating what that meant for the various settings where the EYLF occurs, and that includes family daycare, of course, and outside school hours care and long day care and preschool. So I really value the opportunities I've had to work with family daycare educators. They're quite a special bunch of educators, I think, in a very unique setting.
They sure are, and sometimes they're underestimated by the rest of the sector, which isn't really fair because they're often doing one of the hardest jobs.
Exactly. So it's good to talk about the EYLF and the practices.
Okay, remember with family daycare, I keep saying the EYLF, but it's actually my time, our place as well, because some family daycare educators do have those children of school age. So look, as you know, what we're looking at in this session is the practices of the EYLF. And I feel when I look at the sorts of things that are included in Certificate 3, there's lots of stuff about the outcomes, some stuff about the underpinnings, but not much about the practices. So why are the practices important?
The practices are important because they are actually what we do every day. I think we've got the, we've got the big principles, and they're kind of like the big ticket items, the big issues, but it's the practices that are the things we do every day with children and families and colleagues if we're working in a centre. So they're really the important things. They enact those principles. So they are important. There's 8 of them, slightly different wording in the My Time, Our Place, but really with very similar meaning. Yeah.
So of the practices, which, in your experience, do most educators kind of misunderstand or get wrong or are a little bit scared about?
I would think the assessment for learning is probably the most problematic one. And for various reasons. I think particularly in family daycare educators, have struggled with the time constraints. When you're working with children all the time, full time, there's not much time to do that documenting. I think they often wonder about how much is enough. Will it meet the expectations of NQS, etc.? Is the format right? Those sorts of questions. And just getting that whole, getting the idea that the focus here is on learning, not just on describing what kids are doing, but on the learning, and then being able to kind of keep the documentation under control, because people can drown in it. And, hundreds of photographs or hundreds of notes or whatever. That's not what it's about. It's about, you don't do the documentation until you've actually seen something that's worth documenting. And I think family daycare educators actually have got more chance of doing that than in a busy room. Because...
But isn't it often that, services might insist that educators do a certain number of
There's no rules on that. And so when people say that to me, I say, well, show me where it says anywhere in any of the documents that you have to do 10 or 5 or it's not there. It's one of those myths, Lisa, that's just developed over time. And I can see why a provider might want to put a figure, because they're accountable and they're worried that if they don't put some sort of figure that there won't be enough. But you have to trust your educators. You have to work with your educators and trust them that they're the experts in young children's learning, and they'll know when they see learning, and they'll know that's worth recording, that's worth photographing, that's worth talking to the child about or the family.
So what, have you ever seen like, I know that everyone says, it's up to the individual educator, it's up to the individual service, but what's the best documentation that you've ever seen?
Oh, well, I think it's a combo usually. When I've seen it done well, it's a combination of little notes, which might be on sticky notes or in a diary or loose leaf, whatever, and maybe some photographs. But the photographs are not happy snaps. They're not just photographs of everyone smiling at the camera, because we're not doing a family photo album here. There's a difference. Now, you might take happy snaps of the children for a different purpose, to reassure a parent that the child's had a good day. But for documentation in relation to assessment in family daycare or anywhere, the photos should tell us a picture of a child engaged in some learning, or achieving something, or doing something for the first time, whatever it might be. So it's that tuning in and knowing, yes, this is worth, this is the first time a child's done something. This is the first time a child's mastered something. If this is a child who's really attending to something and concentrating where they've been flitting around a bit, that's worth capturing. So it's that combination. And then the analysis would be the next bit, the bit that sort of says they get it, that the educators understand that this is about learning. Because really all those notes, all those photos, or if you do recordings or whatever, they're not much good to you unless you've analysed them or interpreted them. So it's the educator looking at that and going, this is about this child's learning, and you might link it to one of the learning outcomes, etc., or one of the principles or one of the practices. So I think there's a lot of myth around it, and I think we've made it too hard, and that's not what it's meant to be.
More.
It's not meant to be like that. It's not. Is it? What's the? It's not the tail wagging the dog. Like it's not an end of itself. It's to help do the work better.
And I think that some of that has come in through some of the programs that some of the software programs that people are using that require everything to be bigger than Ben-Hur, and people have forgotten that the main reason for documentation is to enable you to analyse children's learning, just as you said.
Yeah. And you know, trust the educators to know that that's important for that child. And that's something I want to share with the child's family tonight when they come to pick them up. You know, today, for the first time, he really did whatever it might be. Have you seen that at home? Well, that's great. You must have been supporting that at home. I mean, it enables that conversation around learning with the family. You know, in the old days, we used to tell families, you know, how many dirty nappies they had, how many times they went to the toilet, how much they ate, you know, and certainly some families do want a bit of that sort of information. But really, what we're best at doing is saying to the families, you know what they were learning today? They're amazing. They're amazing learners, because that really helps families see themselves as part of that education, that learning journey that a child's on. And I think family daycare is so well placed to do that, because they do have those close connections with families and children over time. So, you know, the EWLF talks about the distance travelled. I think it's beautiful. I love that phrase. And family daycare educators see that distance travel quite often, because they'll have a child from babyhood into toddlerhood and into preschool. So they can definitely say to parents, remember what they were like? You know, and we worked on that, and they've learnt that, and now they're doing this. And that's that terrific concept of the distance travelled in learning. And not all educators get a chance to see that long-term learning.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. Okay. Any other practices that you think are a bit problematic?
Sometimes people aren't sure about the intentional teaching. What does that mean? Does that mean we have to sort of sit and have lessons? No, it doesn't. It just means we have to think about what we're doing and why we're doing it. So, you know, if someone comes in and looks at a family daycare setup, they might think, oh, that looks nice, you know, it's just nice things out. And what they don't know is the thinking that's gone into everything that's there. What resources are there, how it's displayed, how it's adapted and changed over time, etc. That's the intentional teaching bit. And it's the EYLF is just asking educators in that practice to kind of always stop and think about, why am I doing this? And is there another way of doing it? And what is my documentation telling me? You know?
And that can be a lot wider just than the things that clearly fall into the curriculum category. It's about all your practices, really, isn't it? Like, why do the children all have to have lunch at the same time? Or why do, you know, why do we always go into the outdoor area in the afternoon?
Exactly. It's every aspect, your routines, the arrivals, the departures, the lunchtimes, the hand washing, whatever it might be, we're expected to be intentional about.
And do you think that's a problem with family daycare, the use of that word teaching, when obviously family daycare educators are not teachers? Do you think that sometimes family daycare educators could look at that and think that doesn't really apply to us because we're not teachers?
Everyone's teaching children who's with children. you know, whether we're a parent, whether we're a grandma, whether we're a family daycare educator and outside school hours, you know, we're teaching children either implicitly or explicitly, intentionally or not.
Yeah.
Children are looking at the adults around them, and working out what's going on here. What are they telling me? What am I learning from them? I mean, our values, concepts.
I often see in centre-based care people interpreting intentional teaching as group times or times when they set themselves up to, I want to impart this knowledge to children. And that's so not it, is it?
No, it might. Look, there are things that we do. We might be a little bit more didactic. I mean, we don't leave it up to chance around road safety, for example. We don't say, oh, well, go and play about that and you'll learn about that. And oops, they got knocked because they didn't know anything about the rules. I mean, there is, you know, things like oral hygiene. There is some things that we actually do want to teach children. We think it's important. It's often around safety and health matters. Like the hand washing, for example, we can't leave that to chance. And we've learned that through COVID. So, yes, there might be a place for some direct kind of teaching in that sense. But more than likely, when I've seen people do road safety, for example, yes, they might talk about signs and stopping and all that. Then they let the children play that in the backyard. And then they might practice it. They might go for a walk to the shops and practice it. So it's a combination of the direct teaching, playing, and then doing the real thing. That's good teaching. That's good intentional teaching. Yeah.
Yep, for sure. Okay, so one of the things that I get concerned about for family daycare educators is that they're kind of so busy taking care of so many things that, like, their job has really gotten harder since the National Quality Framework came in, because they have, well, maybe it's always been hard, but there's a lot more pressure at the moment on things like making sure you're doing all the compliance stuff, making sure you're following the regulations. How can they possibly manage this at the same time as doing that, as following the practices of the frameworks? Like, I worry that sometimes ensuring that everything is by the book in terms of health and safety, etc., means there's a lack of ability to do anything more than that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Wherever we're working, and family daycare is no exception, our key responsibility is relationships with children, to build those relationships with children, to be fully attuned to children. So for family daycare, I think they've got to think very carefully about how they can manage those compliance things without letting that swamp them, because they've got to be available to the children. One of the ways I think they can do that, and I've seen it done, is that you involve the children where you can in some of that matter. So, for example, hygiene stuff, children being able to pack up for themselves, set up for themselves, etc., so that you're not doing anything for the children they couldn't do for themselves. So that's helping them to learn, but it's also freeing you up. One of the other things, and I've seen it in centre-based, and it can happen in family daycare, is that if you have too many activities out, you spend your whole life checking that those activities are running tickety-boo, and you're not available to do the talk, the conversations, the relationship building. It's, you know, too much novelty, too many new activities. Not a good idea. Not a good idea. You slow the pace down for yourself and for the children. If you focus more on an environment that's inviting play with simple things, but rich play, imaginary play, loose parts play, nature play, that sort of stuff, rather than lots of whiz-bang different activities or crafty things that you have to sit there intensely supervising, etc. So engage the older children where you can, as soon as they can take responsibility. Use child-to-child work too, because that's family daycare's perfect for that, because you've got that maybe a baby, a toddler and a preschooler and all working together. I think you've just got to look at the way you set up the environment so that you're not constantly worrying about things, and you know that the children have got plenty of opportunities there for good learning. I guess they've got to keep advocating too, and they need people like you and me to be advocating for them around, what's possible and what the problems are for them and how we could help. And so the family daycare units are all, the providers really have to step in there and have systems that make it easier for their educators to kind of get on top of that paperwork. Look, there should be time in the day if, to do some notes, do your documentation, whatever, if you're not having to keep getting new stuff out and doing stuff, what can the children access? How could they get that themselves? And, that's all good for them. I do think there's a bit around the pedagogy and the teaching and the resourcing and the environment that can help the family daycare to relax, and that's good for their well-being.
Yeah, for sure.
So that the day should not be pressured. The day should be relaxing for them and relaxing for the children. Now you'll have days, everyone has days where you give me a stiff drink at the end of the day, but that will happen, of course. But I think overall, when they get that nice kind of flow happening, and I mean, we know from research, children need long periods of time to engage with something. They don't immediately get into the home corner and know what they're going to do. They often need time for that. So we should give them that time. And family daycare can do that.
Yeah. I think I read an article somewhere recently on slow pedagogy, and I thought,
Yeah, exactly. I wrote something on the slow food movement. Slow food movement, slow pedagogy. Exactly. Exactly. And it's good for children. I think it was David Elkin wrote that book years ago called The Hurried Childhood, and that is not a good thing. You don't have very long in your childhood. You need to,
take some time to actually be a child. Okay,
Yeah.
look, imagine that you're faced with a new educator or someone who hasn't been doing it for long, and who possibly only has the minimum qualifications, a Certificate 3, hasn't done a lot of professional development, and is just kind of like starting out in the sector. What 3 tips would you give them about how to use the frameworks and practices in the framework to influence how they work with children? Just 3 short, sharp facts.
I think one is you've got to become familiar with it. But I think to try and read the whole thing as a whole, that's a bit much. That's too much. So I'd have a skim through and be familiar that know that there are the belonging, being and becoming, the core values, know that there are some principles and some practices and some outcomes. And then I'd hone in on the bit that really intrigued me or interested me, that I feel a bit comfortable with. And that might be, I might read that more and get to know it more. And I'd work with that before I moved into something else. I think you've got to build on what you always, I think people have to start with what they can do, not with what they can't do.
Okay, so the first thing is know the framework. Yep.
Know the framework and come back to it all the time. I help write the damn thing and I still find things in it. That's what a good document should be able to do. You should be able to dip into them, even if you're a novice and even if you're very experienced, and find stuff in there. But do it when take sections or the section that is important for you at that time or that you feel confident with. I think the second thing I'd say is it's the educating children, you know, family daycare educators are doing that on their own, but really they do need the support of colleagues. So I would say make sure you're part of some sort of network, whether that's a virtual network or a face-to-face network. And they do exist. They've got quite a, you know, I'm aware of some of them, either through your provider or through an educator network, so that you've got a sounding board, you've got someone and a group that you can say, I'm struggling with this, or I'm finding it hard to do that. Or what do they mean by that intentional teaching stuff?
Yeah.
Does that mean I've got to get some work?
And that's something that we've got through this PD in a Pocket PD in your Pocket project. We've started a Facebook group of everyone who's going through this professional development where they can ask those questions. And
exactly, and you don't feel dumb, you don't feel stupid, and somebody else been dying to ask that question. Yeah, I really think that. So for me, they're the three things. Become familiar with the document over time. Start with where you feel confident.
Yep.
Framework, the bits that speak to you or that you like, and kind of become really confident with that before you take on new things, and make sure you've got opportunities to network with other educators.
Mm-hmm.
And they might be different, like it might be a network of people who are all in the same status as you, like a novice or a beginner, but it would also be good to have some more experience, network with more experienced educators. I mean, I've found that right throughout my career, that I've needed that kind of networking. I don't think you ever grow out of that.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
so look, just a few of the practices that, you know, in my observation, possibly some family daycare educators aren't really comfortable with, is the cultural competence one. So can we talk about that? And the other one is the holistic, sorry, I haven't got the words for it, but it's got the word holistic in it.
Yeah. Well, let's start with that one. The holistic approaches just means thinking about the child's, well, I say the head, the body, and the interior life, the sort of soul, if you like. I don't know, the head, the heart, and the body. It's so that we think about the child not as discrete little things, but as a whole person. And there's, you know, that's well described in the framework. So go back and have a little read of it and have a little bit of a think about it. And I think it's not, every educator is probably doing that work, but they might not have thought of it like that.
And is it also, sorry, is it also about the child not just being a child, but the child being part of a family and part of a community? And
yes, absolutely. So, you know, when you greet a child warmly and you might hug them, or you might, you know, make them, you know, you're talking not just, you're talking to all the child, you know, the child's feelings, the child's learning, you know, that child's learning about how you greet people, and so the mind and their emotional states, etc. You're making that connection between home and that transition into the setting. Yeah, there's lots of things educators and family daycare educators would be doing that says to me, yeah, they get that. They've got that holistic approaches. I can see that happening. I really think that's not such a difficult thing to do if you really unpack what it means. Again, you need to have a bit of a discussion with someone. So what does it mean? Let's unpack.
For sure. I think it's the wording of that one that puts people off. Like that word holistic isn't a word that you come across everywhere, especially if, as a lot of our educators have English as a second language, it's a word they may have never come across before.
So think of a baby in family daycare out on a blanket outside under a tree, and the educator may be lying down with the bubby, and that bubby's, there's a whole lot of stuff coming into that bubby's sensory life. The bubby feels safe, the bubby is intrigued by the leaves, listening to the educators. You know, that's holistic. That's holistic.
Yeah.
So I think good teaching, good experiences like that are holistic, you know. You know, when you read a story to a child, you're touching the whole child, particularly if that story connects to something in their life, as you say. And that connects into that cultural competence, because as you pointed out, we don't work with the child in a vacuum. They don't come to us wrapped in bubble wrap. They come to us from their family every day. And that's what that cultural competence is about. It's not, it might have something to do, sometimes it has to do with particular ethnicities, but it is about the culture that every child's family has. So every family.
And that can vary from child to child within the same ethnicity too.
It can. So it's that tuning into the family, knowing what that family, what their aspirations are for their child, you know, what their sort of lifestyle is, without prying, but you pick that up over time. Things the child tells you, things the parents tell you, etc. So the cultural competence is about responding to all of that. And so, you know, if you go into a family daycare home in a certain location, there'd be kind of indicators of where those families might come from. There might be visible signs of cultural representations like.
And is it also about making sure that your home as a family daycare educator has representations of the children in your care and their cultures, so that if, for example, you've got a child who's the son of dirt bike racers, you know, both his mother and his father, you know, are riding dirt bikes all the time. Wouldn't it be great to have something that shows that you understand that, whether it be a picture of them on their dirt bike?
Exactly. Or you'd have some dirt bike magazines in your story corner.
Yep.
And definitely it's those kind of simple connections. If some of the children in your family daycare use you know, serve food in different ways, or have different, you know, you try and do some of that as well, or particular ways of eating or utensils, etc. I mean, there's a whole, the idea is to build it in, not that you just, you know, we used to, in the old days, we used to do things like we do Chinese week or Greek week, and it was what we called that tourist curriculum. You know, we did everything Chinese for a week and then we packed all that up and put it away. That's not, cultural competence is saying that is not what we're doing. We're not doing a tourist curriculum. We're embedding family contexts, which might have ethnicity in them or might not. They could be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander backgrounds. They could be Anglo whatever the background. We're responding to that, and we're competent in that. We know how to do that. Yeah.
And it's also about sharing our own cultures as educators, whether that be ethnicity or, you know, whatever else.
Absolutely. So if you're if you've got musical backgrounds or whatever, artistic background or IT, things that you're passionate about and you love doing and you're good at, you share that with children. So competence kind of, maybe it's more sensitivity to the context of the families that you're working with. Yeah.
So we could replace that word competency with sensitivity.
I quite like that. Yeah. You know, competence suggests that you've got a certain skill level, I guess, to do that work. Again, it's probably something that you build up over time. And when people first start working in this area, I think the hardest thing for them is the working with family. I think often they feel quite confident working with children, but they might find the parent-family work difficult. Although I reckon family daycare people are up for it. They're up for it because that's what they do in family daycare. But that, that does come with time and confidence as you get more confident working with families.
Okay, so just one question, then I'll finish it off. If you could have everyone know one thing about the framework, or if you think, no, let me put it this way. one misconception about the framework that you see in the sector, and how can we overcome that? You know, like what do people universally get wrong about the framework?
Oh, that's a question. I do think it probably is around the learning and assessment for learning, and you know, forgetting that the critical thing is the belonging, being and becoming, the relationship work we do. So those relationships we have with children and families, they're the cornerstone of what we do, and everything else flows from that.
Yeah.
Rather than the other things, you know, the documentation, the photographs, the assessment, the portfolios, that's the wrong way around. It's the wrong way around. Those things are meant to support the work we do in relationship building. Children will only learn when they're in relationship with us and with each other.
Family daycare, you know, educators have that part of it down pat. You know, they have to have good relationships with their children.
Then I have no doubt the children are learning. Yeah, so I think, you know, they just have to be confident about that.
Yeah.
And they have to get clever at documenting how well they do that. I think often people don't realize how skilled they are.
Yeah, I've seen that, isn't it?
I've seen that in out of school hours.
Put them in their houses and tell them they've got to do something, and then they start to have doubts. I wonder why.
Yeah, I've seen that in out of school hours care and family daycare, that not realizing how good they are and how clever they are, and the beautiful work they do with children.
Okay, everyone, I might end it there because I want you to take that thought away with you. You are clever, you are practiced. What else did you say? You are, you know, what you're doing is good.
It's beautiful.
Yeah. Thank you very much for joining us. This has been really good to talk to you about these things.
Pleasure, Lisa, anytime. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
Okay, everyone, welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that interview. I certainly did. There was so much to learn there. So before we finish up, we've now got some time for questions, and we actually had some great questions coming through during that video. The first one was someone asked if we need to link documentation to the EYLF practices as well as the outcomes. So there's nothing specifically to say what linking you need to do with your observations and your documentation. I know we all link to the outcomes, which is fantastic. And it would be a really good idea if you have the time or if you're feeling confident to link to the practices as well. The practices give families a good indication of what we do as educators, whereas the outcomes are more child focused, what the child has learned, how they're developing. The practices will give families a great insight into how that observation or how your documentation is showing what practices you're doing as an educator. So it kind of gives it a bit more context. So if you can link it to practices as well as the outcome, absolutely, it would be a great idea to do that. Another question that came through was, are the practices more focused on intentional teaching or child-focused planning? And this is a really great question. So the thing with the practices is, I certainly find it has a great balance of both. Some practices we know are directly about intentional teaching or other elements of intentional teaching, such as creating environments, which is very teacher-led. But then on the other hand, we see a lot of child-led practices as well. So things like being responsive, learning through play, valuing different cultures, that's really showing that we're following the needs of each child. So it's got a really nice balance of being intentional while also following the needs of each child and being responsive to that. So great question, and I think there's a good balance there. Another question that came through was asking, do we need to do portfolios? And it is a question that a lot of educators ask. The short answer to that is we need to provide evidence that as educators we're documenting the child's learning, but that's kind of as specific as it gets. So we need to find a way of documenting that works for us. So if that's portfolios, fantastic. If it's something else, as long as you can show that you're documenting learning, and that documenting is effective in terms of communicating with parents, and that you can clearly see that a child is progressing and that you're addressing their needs, then the way you do it is really up to you. It's up to you as a service, it's up to you as an educator. So you can have discussions around that of what works for you. And that links into the next question too. Someone was saying, how do I find time for this documentation? And I understand as family daycare educators, it can be incredibly challenging. We don't have time out of ratio or off the floor, so to say. We are by ourselves, and it can be really hard to find that time. So again, I encourage you to do what works for you and to be clever. I really like how Dr. Kennedy said that documentation comes secondary to the relationships that we have with the children. We often get tied up in these requirements for documentation, but we need to remember that that's secondary. If we don't have good things going on in our service and we don't have quality relationships and our children don't have that being, belonging, becoming embedded in the service, then there's not going to be anything great to document. So don't get too tied up in documentation. That is a secondary thing. The most important thing is, as Dr. Kennedy said, is that we've got these positive relationships with our children and our families, and everything else should fall into place. So just going back to the how do I find time for documentation? Once again, do what works for you. There's great technology out there now. There's lots of, excuse me, there's lots of apps where you can document on the spot. So it's really time efficient. You can take your photo, you can do your writing. It will link to EYLF outcomes practices for you. Really time efficient things there. For family daycare educators, another idea is to do your documentation with the children. You can sit down with them of an afternoon and say, what did we learn today? What did we do? What were the highlights? What's something that we want to get better at? What do we want to plan for tomorrow? And sit down and write that documentation with them in the presence of children. And you can give them a voice. You can help them understand the outcomes. You know, you can simplify those EYLF outcomes and the practices and make it that the children understand that, and you can write that documentation with them. So there's a couple of ways that we can do it to make it possible. I know we're all so busy and time poor, but I hope those are some good ideas. So thank you so much for those questions. It was great to see them coming through as we watched the interview there. So that does bring us to the end of our session this evening. Please remember we will be sending you further readings. You can look out for those in your email. And they were handpicked based on this particular topic. So there's great information in there. You can also participate in the Facebook group. If you haven't already joined, you can go to your Facebook and type in PD in your pocket, and you can have some great conversations with the other participants tonight. So thank you everyone so much for taking the time to join us this evening, and we really look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thanks everybody.